My husband chose his ex over me on the day I gave birth, kept a secret relationship with her for years, and now everyone blames me for ending our marriage. Hello everyone, I never imagined I would be in this position, sharing my story with strangers because the people in my life refuse to see the truth. But after everything I've been through, I need to get this off my chest. My husband, the man I trusted with my heart and future, chose his ex over me on the most important day of our lives. He betrayed me not just once, but over and over, keeping a secret relationship with her for years, and now that I've finally had enough, I'm the one being blamed for ending our marriage. Daniel and I met in our late 20s. He was charming, ambitious, and incredibly thoughtful, at least, that's what I believed. From the start, I knew he had an ex, Sophie, who was still in his life. He assured me they were nothing more than friends, that their romantic relationship had ended long before I came into the picture. I wanted to trust him, and at first, I had no reason not to. But over time, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Sophie had a way of inserting herself into our relationship. She would make subtle comments about how well she knew Daniel, about how they used to do things together, and how she understood him in ways no one else could. It was always under the guise of being friendly, but there was an underlying possessiveness that made me uneasy. Whenever I brought it up, Daniel would brush it off, saying I was overreacting or that Sophie was just joking. What made things worse was Daniel's mother, Linda. From the moment I met her, she made it clear she preferred Sophie over me. She would talk about her constantly, reminiscing about the good old days when Sophie and Daniel were together. She would invite Sophie to family gatherings without even consulting me and would always find ways to compare us. Sophie used to cook for Daniel all the time, she'd say with a pointed look whenever I ordered takeout after a long day at work. Sophie always helped me decorate for Christmas, she'd sigh when I suggested we do something different. It was exhausting. No matter what I did, I felt like I was competing with a ghost from Daniel's past, a ghost that wasn't even gone. Despite all of this, I stayed. I loved Daniel, and I kept telling myself that his relationship with Sophie wasn't a threat. But then, the day I gave birth to our son, Leo, everything became painfully clear. I went into labor late at night. It was painful, exhausting, and terrifying. I needed Daniel more than ever. But instead of being by my side, holding my hand through the contractions, he was on his phone, texting Sophie. At first, I didn't know what he was doing. I assumed he was letting his family know what was happening. But then, in the middle of a particularly intense contraction, I caught a glimpse of his screen. Her name. A long string of messages. My heart dropped. "Who are you texting?" I managed to ask through the pain. He looked guilty. "It's nothing. Just Sophie. She's going through a tough time." Sophie. Again. I was in the worst pain of my life, about to bring our child into the world, and he was worried about his ex. I couldn't even process my anger at that moment because another contraction hit, and I had to focus on giving birth. But the resentment was there, bubbling under the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. And then, during one of the scariest moments of my delivery, when I needed him the most, he left the room. I remember the panic that shot through me when I realized he was gone. The nurse tried to reassure me, saying he had probably stepped out for a moment, but I knew better. After what felt like forever, he came back, looking flustered. I was too weak to argue, too emotionally drained to ask questions. But later, when I was holding our son in my arms, I demanded to know where he had been. He hesitated before finally admitting it. Sophie was upset, he said, as if that was a valid excuse. She needed someone to talk to. I couldn't believe it. He had left me, left our child, so he could comfort her. That was the moment something inside me broke. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at him and made a decision. Things were going to change. I told him that Sophie was no longer welcome in our lives. If he wanted our marriage to survive, he needed to cut ties with her. No more texts, no more calls, no more excuses. He agreed, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I thought I had finally put a stop to her interference. But what I didn't know was that Daniel had no intention of truly letting her go. He just got better at hiding it. And that was only the beginning of the betrayal. For a while, I thought things were finally getting better. After the disaster at the hospital, Daniel promised he would cut Sophie out of his life. He swore up and down that he understood how much he had hurt me, how he wanted to focus on our family. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. After all, we had a newborn son now, and I didn't want to start our journey as parents on shaky ground. At first, things seemed normal. Or at least, as normal as they could be after what had happened. Daniel was more present at home, more attentive to Leo. He still had moments where he seemed distant, like his mind was somewhere else, but I chalked it up to new parent exhaustion. I told myself we were healing. I told myself things were fine. I was wrong. Linda had always made it clear she preferred Sophie over me, but after Leo was born, it became even more obvious. I had hoped that becoming a grandmother would change things, that she would finally see me as part of the family instead of an inconvenience standing in Sophie's shadow. But instead, she used her role as a grandmother as a weapon against me. She babysat Leo often, something I initially appreciated. Being a new mom was overwhelming, and I was grateful for any help I could get. But over time, I started to notice small things that didn't sit right with me. Leo would come home talking about Mama Sophie. At first, I thought I misheard. But then, it kept happening. Every time he spent the day at Linda's house, he would return with little comments that made my stomach twist. Mama Sophie plays with me. Mama Sophie gives me cookies. Mama Sophie loves me. I confronted Linda about it, but she just smiled sweetly and dismissed my concerns. "Oh, sweetheart, he's just a baby," she said, waving a hand. You know how kids mix things up. I think it's adorable that he's so loved by so many people. But I knew better. I knew exactly what was happening. Linda was trying to rewrite my son's reality. She was feeding him a version of the truth where Sophie was his mother, where I was just some secondary figure in his life. And the worst part? Daniel did nothing to stop it. I started getting suspicious. If Linda was so comfortable pushing Sophie into my child's life, what else was happening behind my back? One evening, Leo came home clutching a small stuffed bear I didn't recognize. "Who gave you that, sweetheart?" I asked him. He beamed. "Mama Sophie." I felt sick. I pressed him gently, asking where he had seen her, what they had done together. But Leo was only a toddler, and all I got were fragments. Grandma's house, Daddy was there, we played hide and seek. I confronted Daniel that night. "Is Sophie seeing Leo?" I asked, my voice trembling. His reaction told me everything. He froze. Just for a second, but it was enough. Then he lied. "Of course not. Where is this coming from?" I knew he was lying. I could feel it in my bones. So I did something I never thought I would do. I went through my son's things. I searched his backpack, his little pockets, anything that might give me an answer. And then I found it. A small, spiral-bound notebook. A diary, though it was mostly filled with scribbles and stickers. But in between the pages, there were little notes, probably written with Linda's help. Notes about Mama Sophie. Notes about secret visits. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages, each one confirming my worst fears. Leo had been seeing Sophie. Repeatedly. Daniel had allowed it. Linda had encouraged it. And they had all told my son to keep it a secret from me. I couldn't breathe. I waited for Daniel to come home that night. I sat on the couch with the notebook in my lap, my hands shaking. When he walked in, I didn't waste time. "Explain this," I said, throwing the notebook onto the coffee table in front of him. His face went pale. He picked it up and flipped through it, his eyes scanning the words. He knew he was caught. But still, he tried to lie. "Emily, it's not what you think." I saw red. "Not what I think. You've been sneaking around with Sophie behind my back. You've been letting her see our son. You've been letting her pretend to be his mother. And you lied to me about it." He ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate. "Leo loves her. She's good to him." I didn't think it was a big deal. "Not a big deal?" My voice broke. "You let another woman play mommy to our son, Daniel. You encouraged it. You let your mother help erase me from my own child's life. He had nothing to say, because he knew I was right. And that was it. That was the moment I knew our marriage was over. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't give him another chance. I just stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. Get out. Emily, get out, Daniel. You made your choice. And it wasn't me. Linda, of course, wasted no time in playing the victim. She called me hysterical, claiming I was overreacting, that I was cruel for kicking her son out over an innocent mistake. She insisted Sophie was just being kind, that she had no ill intentions. But I knew better. This wasn't an accident. This was a betrayal. And I was done being the fool. I had no idea what would come next, how ugly the divorce would get, how hard I would have to fight to protect my son from the manipulation that had already begun. But one thing was clear. I would never let them take my child from me. And I would never let them rewrite history. Sophie was not Leo's mother. And no matter what they did, I would make sure my son never forgot that. The day Daniel prioritized Sophie over me on Leo's birthday was the final straw. It wasn't just that he chose her over me, his wife, or that he spent that day comforting her while I was at home, struggling to make sure everything for our son's first birthday went smoothly. It was everything that led up to that moment, the constant little betrayals, the lies, the manipulation. Sophie, who had no place in our lives, was being welcomed into our family with open arms by Daniel and his mother. I realized that no matter how much I tried to fight for our relationship, Daniel was never going to choose me. He had already made his choice. On that birthday, I spent hours alone, organizing everything for Leo's celebration while Daniel and Sophie exchanged messages, sharing special moments they had together. I was painfully aware of their emotional connection, how it lingered despite all the promises he made. He had chosen to give his ex the attention she needed while I, his wife, and the mother of his child, was left in the background. It was then that I knew I couldn't take it anymore. Our marriage was over. No more pretending. No more hoping he would change. He wasn't going to choose me, and he hadn't for a long time. I was done. That evening, when he came home and saw Leo's birthday decorations scattered around the living room, I could barely hold it together. I didn't need to say much. The pain was already visible on my face. I can't do this anymore, Daniel, I said quietly, standing at the doorway with my arms crossed. I need you to leave. His face fell. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, I replied, trying not to let my voice waver. It's over. He stood there, stunned. I could see the confusion in his eyes, but I wasn't going to back down. You've chosen Sophie again and again, Daniel. I'm done being second place. Please leave. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he slowly nodded, almost as if he was finally accepting what had been so obvious for a while. I watched him pack his things in a daze, feeling a mix of sadness, anger, and relief. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew it couldn't be worse than this. Once Daniel was gone, I was left alone with my thoughts, and a house that felt emptier than ever. But the more I sat with my feelings, the more I realized how many lies I had been fed. I had trusted Daniel, believed he would change, but the truth was far uglier than I had ever imagined. A few days after he left, I found his iPad on the counter, abandoned and unlocked. In my heart, I knew I shouldn't snoop, but curiosity overtook me. I opened his messages and found years of correspondence with Sophie. There it was. The messages were not just friendly. They were filled with regret, affection, and longing. It was clear that their relationship had never really ended. He had continued to keep Sophie as a part of his life, emotionally invested, even while we were married. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about us sooner, one message read. I didn't want to hurt Emily, but I miss you. I wish I could be with you. My stomach churned as I read through their conversations, each one a painful reminder of how little Daniel had truly been invested in our marriage. The promises, the reassurances, the moments where he had told me everything was fine, it was all a lie. Sophie wasn't just some ex he had outgrown. She was the woman he had never stopped loving. I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of betrayal. How could he have done this to me? How could he have continued to deceive me while leading me to believe we were building something real? I shut the iPad off and sat in silence, letting the reality of it sink in. The pain was overwhelming, but there was also a sense of clarity. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. This wasn't my fault. A month later, I finally mustered the courage to pack up Daniel's belongings. I moved his clothes, his things, out of the bedroom and into the garage. I had finally taken control of the situation, and as I did it, a weight lifted from my chest. I didn't need him. I had already learned that. When he arrived to pick up his things, I had nothing left to say. There were no more questions, no more attempts at understanding. I had already done the hard work of accepting the truth. I know everything, I told him, standing tall in the doorway, staring him down. I know about you and Sophie. I know you were never fully with me. He looked at me, guilt and shame clouding his face. Emily, please. No, I interrupted. You don't get to do this. You don't get to beg me for forgiveness, and you don't get to try and gaslight me. I'm done. I watched as he tried to apologize, his voice breaking, but I didn't let him in. I didn't let him twist the truth or manipulate me into believing his lies. Goodbye, Daniel, I said firmly, shutting the door behind him. After Daniel left for good, things got messy quickly. He didn't want to let go of the family he'd built with me, but I had made my decision. I filed for divorce and started the custody process for Leo. The legal battle was long and exhausting, but I knew it was necessary. I had to protect my son from the toxic influence of Sophie and Daniel's manipulation. As expected, Daniel continued to reach out, begging me to reconsider. He sent texts, emails, even flowers. But I stayed firm. I wasn't going back. The man I had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who had chosen his ex over me and our son. I cut off all communication. My lawyer became the middleman, and Daniel's efforts to reconcile were left unanswered. The process wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I wasn't about to let someone who had broken my trust so completely have any more power over me. Healing wasn't quick. In fact, there were days when I thought I might never feel whole again. But I focused on myself. I spent time with Leo, helping him adjust to the new reality, making sure he knew both of his parents still loved him, even if we weren't together anymore. Leo struggled, of course. At his age, he didn't fully understand what had happened. But I reassured him every day that things would be okay. I told him that even though Daddy wasn't living with us anymore, we were still a family. He would be okay, and so would I. I learned to prioritize my own well-being. I rediscovered parts of myself that I had lost in my marriage, the parts of me that had once been independent, strong, and confident. This experience, painful as it was, taught me something invaluable. I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was enough. I had to believe in myself and trust that I could move forward, no matter what. And I did. The pain eventually faded, and in its place was strength. I was no longer defined by Daniel or his lies. I was defined by my own resilience and by the love I had for my son. This chapter of my life was over, and the next one was just beginning. It would be one where I controlled my own destiny. No more manipulation, no more lies, no more choosing someone else over me. I was finally free.